Operation Bagration, the full narrative of the Wehrmacht's destruction. Exactly 3 years had passed since the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in its ambitious invasion campaign. However, the situation had changed drastically since that scorching summer of 1941. The devastating defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk had made it clear to Hitler's forces that victory was out of reach. Now, in 1944, Operation Bagration had definitively sealed the fate of the German army in the east. What had once been an overwhelming advance had turned into a desperate retreat. Germany had forever lost its dominance on the Eastern Front. Thousands of kilometers from the Atlantic coast, in the dense and vast forests of Belarus, the Soviet Union was preparing a devastating offensive against the forces of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, in the early hours of June 6, 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy, D-Day, under intense fire from German machine guns in their struggle to secure strategic positions on the French coast, while the Soviet High Command finalized the details of an operation intended to deal a lethal blow to the Wehrmacht. The campaign, named Operation Bagration in honor of the legendary Russian general Peter Bagration, a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, had a single purpose: to crush the enemy and liberate the occupied territories on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration took shape during the Tehran Conference held in late 1943 in Iran, where the leaders of the three major Allied powers discussed the strategy to definitively expel Axis forces from the Soviet Union. During the meeting, the American and British leaders committed to opening the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe, with a landing in France planned for the spring of 1944. This maneuver would force the Wehrmacht to divert a significant number of divisions from the Eastern Front to confront the Allied invasion, thereby weakening its lines in the east. Stalin saw in this situation a strategic opportunity and decided to launch a major offensive in Belarus, taking advantage of the impact that the Allies' arrival in Normandy would have on German defenses. Aware that the Nazis would not expect a massive attack in such difficult terrain, Stalin planned a Red Army advance through rivers, forests, and swamps, trusting that surprise would work in his favor. The offensive was to begin shortly after D-Day, aiming for mid-June 1944, when pressure on the Western Front would be at its peak. The Soviet General Staff considered several options before finalizing the offensive plan in April 1944. Two main strategies were considered: an advance towards southwestern Ukraine to invade Romania and secure the Polesti oil fields, thus expanding Soviet influence in the Balkans, or an offensive in the Baltic states to reach the Baltic Sea coast and isolate Army Group North, dividing Axis forces in Eastern Europe. However, both options were discarded, and an offensive in Belarus was chosen, where the Germans least expected it, allowing the Red Army to advance toward Poland and gain the upper hand in the race to Berlin. In 1944, the once powerful Wehrmacht was in a state of slow but irreversible collapse. Although armored production had increased under the direction of Albert Speer, the reduction of German territory and the shortage of manpower made it increasingly difficult to sustain the war effort. Its biggest mistake was clinging to every inch of territory, refusing any tactical withdrawal that would allow it to regroup its forces. In early 1944, Hitler ordered that all key cities and communication centers be turned into fortresses that had to be defended to the last man, allowing withdrawal only with his authorization. As an additional measure, he prohibited the construction of defensive positions in the rear, convinced that soldiers would prefer to retreat rather than fight to the end. These decisions only accelerated the deterioration of the Eastern Front, paving the way for the devastating offensive that was to come. Under this erroneous perception of the war, by spring 1944, the German army had been left completely on the defensive, with no capacity to launch offensive maneuvers and under a strict order from Hitler prohibiting any withdrawal, a decision that would prove catastrophic for its soldiers over time. Although Belarus represented the heart of the Eastern Front, its defenses were far from solid. From the north of the Pripyat marshes to the Baltic Sea, approximately 60% of the front extended, but only 40% of German forces were deployed there. The German High Command considered the region, due to its wooded and swampy terrain, unsuitable for large-scale armored offensives. Instead, the priority was in Ukraine, where the Soviet attack was expected. This territory, with its mostly flat geography, had been the scene of Soviet offensives in late 1943, and if it fell, would open the way to Poland and subsequently Germany. Moreover, the growing threat over France influenced strategic decision-making. Since 1943, the Western Front had become the Reich's priority, prompting a significant transfer of resources. While in previous years, 80% of German armored forces were deployed on the Eastern Front, that figure had now dropped to less than half. The Luftwaffe, tasked with defending Germany from Allied bombings, had also diverted much of its squadrons to the west, leaving air control in the hands of the Soviet Air Force. In this context, Army Group Center had gradually lost strength, with several of its units transferred to France or Ukraine in anticipation of future enemy offensives. One example of this was the transfer of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which further weakened the defensive structure in Belarus. Although theoretically the front line of Army Group Center had been reduced after the loss of Crimea and the retreat of Army Group South, in practice its situation became even more vulnerable as its southern flank was exposed to a possible Soviet offensive from Ukraine. By then, Army Group Center had become mostly an infantry force, with only one active armored division and the majority of its troops entrenched in fortified cities, following direct orders from Hitler. Air cover was minimal. The 6th Luftwaffe, based in Minsk, had about 800 aircraft, but only 40 Messenger Bf-109 fighters were operational, along with 450 Junker Ju-87 and Heinkel He-111 bombers, a force insufficient to counter Soviet air superiority. At the eve of the Soviet offensive, Army Group Center had 34 infantry divisions, 2 Luftwaffe field divisions, 5 security divisions, and 1 panzer division, which had only half of its full strength. In addition, there were some Hungarian divisions in the rear, totaling 52 divisions and 400,000 men. In terms of artillery, they had approximately 9,500 pieces, including mortars, guns of various calibers, and rocket launch batteries. However, despite these numbers, the Red Army's fire superiority was overwhelming. As for armored forces, the situation was equally concerning. Army Group Center had only 11% of German tanks present on the Eastern Front, equivalent to 553 combat vehicles. Of these, 480 were assault guns, while the rest were specialized tank destroyers. In the Orsha sector, about 40 Tigers were deployed, but by June 23, only 19 were operational. Although Army Group Center remained the largest of the 4 army groups deployed by Germany in the east, its ability to resist was minimal in the face of a massive offensive. The Soviets had concentrated 2.4 million soldiers, supported by 5,000 tanks, 36,000 artillery pieces, and more than 5,000 aircraft, an overwhelming force that far surpassed any German attempt at defense. Operation Bagration begins the final blow at 4 a.m. on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after the launch of Operation Barbarossa. The Red Army unleashed one of the most devastating offensives on the Eastern Front. A total of 5,000 artillery pieces roared in unison along the 700 kilometers separating Russia and Belarus, collapsing the forward trenches of Army Group Center under incessant shelling. The artillery fire not only obliterated German defenses, but also covered the area with phosphorus and smoke shells, sowing chaos among enemy troops. While the artillery pounded the front, the 3rd Air Army launched a brutal air offensive. In a total of 6,450 missions, the Soviet Air Force annihilated fortified positions, destroyed communication networks, and wreaked havoc in the German rear. During the course of the attack, the German Luftwaffe suffered a severe blow, losing 11 aircraft in combat. Operation Bagration had begun with unstoppable force. Following the devastating artillery bombardment came the assault by Soviet infantry. Unlike the massive and uncoordinated charges of previous offensives, this time the attacks were methodical and well organized. According to German reports, Soviet soldiers advanced in compact and coordinated formations, supported by heavy weapons fire and closely backed by armored units, ready to exploit any breach in enemy lines once the infantry broke through the front. Meanwhile, in the Vitebsk salient, the defenses of the 3rd Panzer Army began to collapse under the pressure of Soviet attacks. The situation was untenable, and it became evident that the Red Army intended to encircle the city and trap the 3 German divisions defending it. Marshal Ernst Busch warned the German High Command that resistance within Vitebsk was unsustainable and requested authorization for a withdrawal. However, the response from the German High Command was clear. No reinforcements were available, as priority was still given to the expected Soviet offensive in Ukraine. Even if the German High Command had permitted a retreat, Hitler would not have tolerated it. His order was clear. The troops were to hold out to the last man within the city's defenses. What the Germans did not know at the time was that the 6th Guards Army had already broken through the lines north of Vitebsk, and that General Ivan Bagration had given the green light to the second phase of the offensive. His goal was clear: to close the pincers from the south and complete the encirclement of the city. Further south, in the sector of the 4th German Army, Soviet forces managed to penetrate the German defenses, but without achieving a decisive breakthrough. Their main objective was to take control of the strategic Moscow-Minsk highway, which ran through the Orsha sector. This area, which had already been the scene of intense fighting in 1933, had a higher defensive density than the rest of the front and was defended by some of the best German divisions deployed in Belarus. Among them stood out the 78th Sturm Division, which had 100 cannons and about 50 armored vehicles, while its southern flank was covered by the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, a well-equipped and organized unit. Faced with such a well-positioned enemy, the Red Army designed a meticulous attack. 5 Soviet infantry divisions were assigned to this sector, with 3 of them tasked with attacking in the southern zone where German defenses were strongest. The offensive began with the deployment of specialized armored units, each with 10 T-34 tanks equipped with mine rollers, followed at 150 meters by a regiment of heavy tanks. Next, assault engineer battalions advanced, followed by another regiment of ISU-152 self-propelled guns. Finally, the infantry, supported by flamethrower tanks, advanced to consolidate the attack. Despite the impressive strength of this assault, the German defenses managed to hold. The men of the 78th Sturm Division, well entrenched and armed with Panzerfausts and MG-42 machine guns, managed to momentarily contain the Soviet offensive. However, given the overwhelming numerical superiority, it was only a matter of time before the Soviets found a vulnerable point. Shortly thereafter, 2 divisions of the 11th Guards Army managed to break through to the north through a forest, allowing General Ivan Chernyakhovsky to exploit the breach by sending in a mechanized group to consolidate the advance. Realizing the danger, Marshal Ernst Busch resorted to his last reserves and ordered the Feldherrenhall Division to take up positions on the Dnieper River, establishing a second defensive line in a desperate attempt to halt the Soviet advance. In the southern sector, towards Bobroysk, the Soviet offensive encountered its only point of stagnation. The difficult terrain, combined with the fierce resistance of the 9th German Army, managed to temporarily halt the Red Army's advance, albeit at an extremely high cost for the German forces. Faced with this situation, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky decided to pause the attack and ordered it to resume the following day, preceded by a new massive bombardment, both artillery and air, with the aim of further wearing down enemy positions. By the end of the first day of fighting, the Soviet offensive was advancing as planned. Vitebsk was practically encircled, and the units of the 11th Guards Army were dangerously close to the strategic Moscow-Minsk highway. However, the German High Command, repeating the same mistakes made in France days earlier, remained convinced that the main attack would take place in Ukraine, which led to the decision to not send reserves from the south. This decision would prove catastrophic in the days to come. In the northern sector of the offensive, Soviet troops achieved their first victory during the night of the 23rd to the 24th. The 4th Army managed to break through the defenses of the German 9th Corps, advancing to the city's second defensive line. At the same time, the 6th Guards Army posed a serious threat of encirclement. At 2:45 a.m., the order was given to the 9th Corps to evacuate the second line and retreat west of the Dnieper River. By noon on the 24th, the Red Army's vanguard units had reached the eastern bank of the river and could have crossed it if the Germans had not destroyed the bridges, even though they still had troops on the eastern side. That same morning, Commander Reinhardt, in charge of the 3rd Panzer Army, realized that the Soviet plan was to encircle Vitebsk, but it was already too late. By late morning, the forces of the 6th Guards Army and the 43rd Army managed to meet west of Vitebsk, closing the encirclement around the 53rd Army Corps. In an attempt to break the isolation, it was proposed that the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division attack from the southwest, but before acting, authorization was requested from the OKH. Hitler, however, rejected the proposal, which forced Busch to order the 53rd Army Corps to attempt a breakout from within using 2 Luftwaffe divisions, while the other 2 infantry divisions continued the defense of the city. At 8:15 p.m., Hitler finally authorized a breakout attempt on condition that if successful, the forces would retreat to the Tiger defensive line. However, he set an inflexible requirement. The 206th Infantry Division, commanded by General Hitter, had to remain in Vitebsk and resist to the last man. What the Germans did not know at the time was that the 6th Guards Army had already broken through the lines north of Vitebsk, and that General Ivan Bagration had given the green light to the second phase of the offensive. His goal was clear: to close the pincers from the south and complete the encirclement of the city. Meanwhile, the night brought new difficulties for the trapped German forces. The 4th Luftwaffe Division, pressured on multiple fronts, began losing positions and desperately requested aerial resupply. However, Soviet air superiority made any supply operations impossible, leaving the division without reinforcements or provisions. The situation became even more serious when the 6th Luftwaffe Division and the 246th Infantry Division also came under direct threat from the 39th Army. In a final attempt to avoid catastrophe, permission was again requested to evacuate the 206th Division and reinforce the surrounded units. Hitler, instead of authorizing the withdrawal, sent an officer by plane with clear orders. The city had to be defended to the last man. As a result, the 2 trapped divisions, along with part of the 206th, were completely isolated southwest of Vitebsk with no possibility of escape. By the afternoon of the 26th, the German troops clung desperately to their positions against the relentless assaults of the Soviet 39th Army. Seeing that the situation was unsustainable, General Gollwitzer devised a nighttime escape attempt, dividing his forces in the hope that at least part of them could break through enemy lines. At 3:45 a.m., he sent a final encrypted message to Reinhardt requesting information about friendly positions and asking for air support to facilitate the breakout. That would be the last transmission from the 53rd Army Corps. With the arrival of the 27th, the few units that managed to break the encirclement found themselves in hostile terrain, completely isolated and without the possibility of receiving help, hunted by partisans who showed no intention of taking prisoners. The survivors wandered aimlessly in search of contact with the German front. According to Soviet reports, about 20,000 German soldiers died and another 10,000 were captured. In contrast, German figures indicated 5,000 fatalities and approximately 22,000 prisoners. What is indisputable is that only a small number of combatants managed to reach German lines after the collapse of Vitebsk. The brutal Soviet assault had caught the Army High Command off guard, which still maintained the belief that the offensive in Belarus was nothing more than a diversion and that the main blow would come in Ukraine. Hitler's stubborn refusal to allow a strategic withdrawal had sealed the fate of thousands of soldiers sacrificed in the futile defense of a city that by then was far behind the overwhelming advance of the Soviet armored columns. However, the Vitebsk catastrophe was only the prelude to an even greater defeat. Despite the enormous offensive effort of the Soviet forces, the attack launched to the south by 3 divisions on the 23rd barely managed to overcome the 1st German defensive line. The 78th Division not only successfully resisted, but began constructing a second defensive line with the goal of further slowing the enemy advance. While the fighting was concentrated on the Moscow-Minsk highway, the 1st Guards Infantry Division found an alternative route north of the German positions, breaking through an area of forests and swamps. A reconnaissance patrol discovered that a railway crossed the swampy area. Although narrow, it offered a potential route of advance. Betting everything on this option, General Galitsky ordered the movement of his reserves along this new route. The Germans, detecting the maneuver, launched a counterattack in the Lake Areki area on June 24th. Although the attempt to stop the offensive was unsuccessful, the German action caused a delay in Soviet plans, which forced the 5th Guards Tank Army to be redirected north to reinforce Galitsky's troops. Finally, on June 25th, the 11th Guards Army managed to break through the 78th Division's defense and began its advance toward Orsha. This breakthrough convinced General von Tippelskirch of the need to withdraw to a new defensive line on the Dnieper River to avoid total collapse. However, the OKH rejected the request for withdrawal. Faced with this refusal, Tippelskirch acted pragmatically, and after assuring his superiors that he would fight to the last man, discreetly ordered his units to begin a staggered retreat to the rear. Despite his efforts, the authorization to abandon Orsha was denied directly by Hitler. By the night of the 26th, the 2nd Soviet Tank Corps managed to encircle Orsha from the north, while an armored brigade completed the encirclement from the west. The sit fell between the night of the 26th and the early morning of the 27th after a coordinated assault between the 11th Guards Army and the 31st Army, securing a crucial victory for Soviet forces. After the fall of Orsha, the 5th Guards Tank Army was ordered to exploit the breach and redirect its advance southwest. The largest concentration of Soviet tanks began to move with a clear objective: Minsk. It was then that the German High Command finally understood that this was not merely a diversionary maneuver, but a large-scale offensive. Although the idea still persisted that another significant attack was being prepared in Ukraine, the decision was made to reinforce Army Group Center with the units that had been denied to it a month earlier. On June 26th, the 5th Panzer Division arrived in Minsk with the desperate mission of stopping the Soviet advance on the Minsk-Moscow highway. At that time, the 5th Panzer still maintained considerable combat power, with 70 Panthers, 55 Panzer IVs, and the 505th Heavy Battalion with 29 Tiger tanks. The defensive plan was to establish a containment line on the Berezina River, allowing the 4th Army to conduct an organized retreat to safer positions. However, upon arriving at the Berezina area, the soldiers of the 5th Panzer found a chaotic scene. Thousands of retreating troops were crowding the river bridges trying to cross, while abandoning enormous amounts of military equipment amid the confusion. Vehicles and supplies were being left behind en masse, while constant attacks by the Soviet Air Force turned the retreat into a nightmare. What was supposed to be a key defensive line had become a point of absolute disaster, with the front collapsing and enemy forces advancing without significant resistance. The battle for Minsk was about to become an even greater catastrophe for the German forces. The first clash took place in the afternoon of Kupki, when M4 Sherman tanks of the 3rd Guards Tank Corps clashed with the Tiger I tanks of the 505th Heavy Battalion. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Soviet forces managed to take the city at dawn on the 29th. However, their advance was finally halted in Borisov, where the engineers of the 5th Panzer Division managed to slow their offensive. Meanwhile, the 29th Tank Corps managed to cross the Berezina River near the Studenka area, but a swift counterattack by the 5th Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion forced them to withdraw. With that crossing blocked, the Soviets, supported by engineer units, attempted to forge a path through the swamps northwest of Borisov, managing to encircle German defensive positions on June 29th. Intense fighting between the 11th Guards Army and the 5th Panzer near Kostriza marked the beginning of an imminent collapse for German forces. Finally, on June 30th, the 216th Division succeeded in cutting the Moscow-Minsk highway, while several Soviet units crossed the Berezina. The 21st Tank Corps crossed the river north of the 5th Panzer, while the 3rd Mechanized Corps did so farther south, using their own vehicles as makeshift submerged obstacles to create a ford south of Borisov. 3 divisions of the 11th Guards Army also managed to cross the river, annihilating the weak resistance offered by 5 regiments of the Feldgendarmerie. Even farther south, the 31st Soviet Army crossed the Berezina and overwhelmed the positions of the German 31st Infantry Division.
Between June 30th and June 1st, Soviet forces crossed the river in multiple sectors without encountering organized resistance capable of stopping their advance. The Luftwaffe attempted several attacks with Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter bombers in the hope of halting the Soviet armored push. However, the Soviet air superiority and German disorganization prevented these raids from having any significant impact on the battlefield. With the loss of the Berezina, the road to Minsk was virtually open for the Soviet vanguards. Finally, the 5th Guards Infantry Division completely sealed the encirclement around Borisov. At the same time, the 3rd Guards Tank Corps began its assault on the Berezina Bridge, just as the 1st T-34s attempted to cross it. The Germans detonated the explosives previously placed and destroyed the structure, blocking passage. However, despite the demolition, the fighting continued among the ruins of the bridge, where German defenders resisted fiercely. However, the Red Army found other crossing points and gradually managed to cross the river, bringing the battle into the heart of the city. For Borisov, the storm of steel on the southern front, while the 3rd Belarusian front advanced from the north toward Minsk, the 1st Belarusian front, under the command of Rokossovsky, moved in from the south. On the first day, the advance was limited due to the difficult marshy terrain, which prevented significant progress.
However, on June 24th, the situation changed radically. The Soviet forces managed to open considerable breaches in the defensive line of the 134th Infantry Division, with penetrations in some sectors reaching depths of up to 10 kilometers. Alarmed by the gravity of the situation, General Hans Jordan, commander of the German 9th Army, requested permission from Marshal Busch to deploy the main available reserve, the 20th Panzer Division. However, the unit was still in the process of re-equipping and was not fully operational. It had only 71 Panzer IVs available and only half of its Panther tanks were ready for combat. As soon as the 20th Panzer began its advance, the Soviet 65th Army exploited a breach south of Babrusk and launched a simultaneous counterattack. Seeing the opportunity, Rokossovsky ordered the 1st Guards Tank Corps to advance through the seam breach. Facing the threat of encirclement, General Jordan ordered the 20th Panzer to withdraw and head south. The retreat was slow due to the poor condition of the roads and the multitude of refugees. Soon, the vanguard of the 20th Panzer clashed with Soviet forces south of Babrusk. Despite destroying more than 60 enemy armored vehicles, the Germans also suffered significant losses and failed to halt the Soviet advance. Meanwhile, in the north, the 1st Guards Tank Corps was about to encircle the German troops on the eastern bank of the Berezina. Fearing Hitler's reaction, Marshal Busch forbade any retreat as long as there was still a chance to contain the Soviets. On June 26th, the 20th Panzer withdrew to the outskirts of Babrusk under pressure from the 1st Guards Tank Corps from the south and the 9th Tank Corps from the east. The next day, the 9th Corps captured the main Berezina crossings, blocking the German retreat and trapping several infantry divisions. Rokossovsky took advantage of the German collapse by sending the 1st Mechanized Corps westward to prevent any counterattack from Baranovichi. Facing the critical situation, Busch and General Jordan flew to Germany to try to convince Hitler and the OKH to abandon the strategy of defending at all costs. Hitler's reaction was immediate, furious. He dismissed Jordan on June 27th and the next day replaced Busch, appointing Marshal Model in his place. Instead of reconsidering his stance, he reaffirmed the order to resist at all costs, condemning thousands of soldiers to imminent encirclement. Meanwhile, in Babruysk, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The 1st Belarusian front had trapped more than 40,000 soldiers in an area of barely 25 kilometers in diameter east of the city. Several breakout attempts were made, but Soviet artillery contained them with intense fire. Shortly after, the Soviet Air Force joined the attack, wreaking havoc among the encircled troops. According to Soviet sources, 10,000 Germans were killed and 6,000 were captured, while the survivors managed to retreat toward Babrusk only to become surrounded again within the city. In a desperate attempt, Hitler ordered the 12th Panzer Division to be sent from Army Group North, but with only 44 Panzer IVs, it could not arrive in time. On June 27th, Soviet infantry launched the assault on the city. In a scenario similar to Vitebsk, the OKH allowed a breakout attempt on the condition that at least one division remained in Babrusk. At 2300 on June 28th, the German infantry, supported by the few remaining tanks of the 20th Panzer, launched a desperate offensive. After intense fighting, a vulnerable point in the encirclement was identified northeast of the city, and waves of German soldiers passed through it in the darkness. However, at dawn, they were attacked by Soviet infantry before reaching the positions of the 12th Panzer, which was 20 kilometers away. Ultimately, about 15,000 soldiers managed to escape, though disarmed and completely demoralized. On June 29th, after 2 days of fierce combat, Babruysk fell into Soviet hands. In less than a week, the First Belarusian Front had destroyed or captured 366 armored vehicles and 2,664 artillery pieces. German casualties amounted to 50,000 men, while another 20,000 were taken prisoner. With the total destruction of the Ninth Army, Rokossovsky gave the order to advance toward Minsk. His objective was, together with the Third Belarusian Front, to encircle the German Fourth Army and the scattered remnants of the Ninth that were still managing to retreat northward. Minsk in flames, the last German stronghold in Belarus. By the end of June, both the OKH and Hitler himself finally understood that the offensive in Belarus was not merely a diversionary attack, but a large-scale operation. However, the reinforcements available to Army Group Center were scarce, so Minsk would have to be defended with the units already on the ground. Hitler's order to resist at all costs had turned the German forces between Borisov and Minsk into a disorganized and demoralized group. Nevertheless, it would be these remnants tasked with halting the advance of the Soviet fronts heading toward the city. Given the gravity of the situation, the only viable strategy was to delay the Soviet advance as long as possible while evacuating the city. The Soviet forces attacked Minsk from 3 directions. The fierce resistance of the 5th Panzer on the Moscow-Minsk highway forced the 29th Tank Corps to shift northward, advancing through the forests with little opposition, though at a slower pace. Meanwhile, the rest of the 5th Tank Army continued its offensive along the highway with support of the 11th Guards Army. In the south, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps managed to cross the Berezina at Morovo on July 1st without encountering resistance, allowing it to advance rapidly toward Minsk. Between July 1st and 2nd, the 5th Panzer and the Tigers of the 505 Heavy Battalion engaged in intense combat against the 5th Guards Tank Army. The Germans were defending the only railway line that allowed the evacuation of the city and refused to yield ground. According to their reports, they managed to destroy 295 Soviet armored vehicles, 125 of them knocked out by the Tigers of the 505. However, this resistance came at a cost. By July 8th, the 5th Panzer had only 18 operational tanks left, while all the Tigers of the 505 had been destroyed or were out of service. Following his usual pattern, Hitler declared Minsk a fortress city. However, only 1,800 soldiers were initially in the city, with another 12,000 arriving later. For the first time, Hitler relented and allowed the evacuation on July 2nd. In the early hours of July 3rd, the 2nd Tank Corps reached the southern sector of Minsk. Shortly after, the 4th Armored Brigade loaded as many infantrymen as possible onto its tanks and broke through the weakened German defenses. Hours later, the 1st Guards Tank Corps of the 1st Belarusian Front joined the attack from the southeast. In the following days, 2 more Soviet armies joined the offensive. With the fall of Minsk, the first major objective of Operation Bagration had been achieved. The encirclement of Minsk trapped a large number of German soldiers east of the city, as many divisions were still crossing the Berezina when the isolation was completed. Soviet infantry immediately began operations to eliminate these pockets of resistance. During the first days of July, German escape attempts were relatively organized, allowing several units to break through Soviet lines and retreat westward in some order. However, as the days passed, the lack of supplies and ammunition weakened their fighting capacity, gradually reducing the chances of escape. By July 9th, the last German stronghold of resistance had been annihilated, although Soviet infantry continued to comb the region for stragglers for weeks. According to Soviet sources, of 15,000 men encircled east of Minsk, only about 1,000 managed to escape. The speed of the Soviet advance also overtook numerous units of the 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Army, although they managed to retreat northward. By then, Army Group Center had practically been annihilated. 17 divisions were completely destroyed, and German casualties reached 300,000 men, half of whom were captured. The total destruction of the 9th Army represented Germany's worst military defeat of the entire Second World War. In less than a week, the Red Army had eliminated more divisions and inflicted more casualties on the enemy than the Germans had suffered at Stalingrad. This devastating breach in the defensive lines forced the German High Command to transfer reinforcements from Army Group North and South, severely weakening both fronts. The collapse of Army Group Center left Germany without an effective barrier in Belarus. The gateway to the heart of the Reich was now completely open.
Storm of Steel, the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive. The OKH was well aware that Army Group South, also known as North Ukraine, would be the next target of a Soviet offensive, although it did not know the exact date. Having sent part of its forces to reinforce Army Group Center, it was weakened, something the Soviets would not take long to exploit. Opposing them was one of the largest concentrations of the Red Army, the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Konev, with more than 1 million soldiers, 1,600 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and 2,800 aircraft. Additionally, it would be supported by Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front, positioned further north. Under the command of General Josef Harp, Army Group South had 5 panzer divisions, 1 motorized division, and 34 infantry divisions. Weeks earlier, it would have been in a position to face Konev's forces on equal terms, but after the transfer of troops northwards, its strength had been reduced to 900,000 soldiers, 900 tanks, 9,000 artillery pieces, and 700 aircraft. However, its defenses were deep and fortified, reaching up to 30 kilometers in some sectors. The magnitude of the Soviet buildup made it impossible to conceal the target of the offensive, which was clearly aimed at Lvov. Aware of the Soviet tactic of massive artillery barrages, the German command began to withdraw its artillery to rear positions to minimize losses. Konev detected the movement and decided to act first, without waiting for the initial bombardment. On July 13th, he launched his infantry against the German lines. The defenders, this time with artillery and Luftwaffe support, put up fierce resistance. However, the overwhelming Soviet superiority eventually prevailed. After 2 days of intense fighting, the Red Army encircled the city of Brody, while the 13th Army opened a breach in the front, allowing mechanized forces to advance northward. The Germans maintained strong resistance east of Lvov, prompting General Harp to resort to his strategic reserve. On July 14th and 15th, he sent the 1st and 8th Panzer Divisions to try to halt the Soviet offensive. Meanwhile, Konev, who had orders not to deploy his tanks until the infantry had broken through the enemy defenses, realized that German resistance would not collapse without armored support. On July 16th, he ordered the 3rd Guards Tank Army to advance through a narrow corridor at Koltov, followed the next day by the 4th Tank Army. On the 17th, the Soviet vanguard reached Lvov and engaged the German panzers. The situation worsened for the Wehrmacht on July 18th, when Rokossovsky joined his offensive with Konev's, launching an attack toward Kovel, penetrating Polish territory. That same day, the failed assassination attempt against Hitler in East Prussia, combined with constant defeats in France and on the Eastern Front, shattered the morale of German troops who were beginning to see the war as a lost cause. In Lvov, the Soviet offensive advanced more slowly than expected. The initial armored assault failed due to the swampy terrain surrounding the city, allowing Harp to reinforce the defense with infantry units. Konev, for his part, avoided committing more tanks to such a difficult advance. Each day of resistance in Lvov represented valuable time gained for the Germans, who rushed to reinforce their new defensive line along the San River. However, on July 22nd, the city of Brody fell into Soviet hands, with 30,000 German soldiers captured and several Soviet divisions freed. Pressure on Lvov increased significantly with reinforcements arriving from the First Belarusian Front. Konev decided not to wait any longer and on July 24th launched the assault on the city. Instead of holding out to the end, the German garrison ignored orders to stand firm and chose to evacuate the city on the night of the 26th, retreating toward the Carpathians. At dawn the next day, Lvov fell into Soviet hands. That same July 27th, the 3rd Guards Tank Army seized the city of Przemyśl in a swift assault. On July 27, 1944, the collapse of the defensive system in Galicia became inevitable when the First Ukrainian Front took Lvov and Przemyśl, previously evacuated by Axis forces. These advances allowed the 3rd Guards Tank Army to cross the Vistula River for the first time within hours, establishing a bridgehead near Magnushev that quickly expanded to 5 kilometers wide and 3 deep. In an attempt to retake the western bank, the 4th Panzer Army launched multiple counterattacks, but the 1st Ukrainian Front responded by deploying the 13th Army and a large concentration of artillery. Not only did they repel the German assaults, but expanded the bridgehead to 20 kilometers, reaching just 65 kilometers from Warsaw. The advance in eastern Poland began to slow by late July 1944. The 2nd Belarusian Front encountered difficulties in the Augustov Forest, where remnants of the German 4th Army offered fierce resistance. In Leipzig, they managed to temporarily retake the city before being expelled again by the Soviets, and even destroyed 180 enemy armored vehicles in another engagement. However, the German defense could barely hold once Soviet troops dismantled the fortifications of the 50th Infantry Division at Nemen and Svislach. The fall of Bialystok was imminent. On July 27th, Soviet armored forces entered the city, consolidating their control over the region. By late July 1944, the Red Army launched its final offensive in South Latvia, with the Second Baltic Front overcoming the defenses of the Panther Line and the First Baltic Front capturing the city of Daugavpils. During the operation, a group of Tiger tanks ambushed Soviet forces in Krasnia, destroying 23 enemy armored vehicles, including 6 IS-2 Stalin tanks and 17 T-34s, as well as 6 anti-tank guns, without suffering any losses. A few days later, mechanized units of the 3rd Belarusian Front managed to encircle and capture several German columns, advancing rapidly. On July 28th, they took the crucial railway junction of Shaului, and on the next day reached the fishing village of Kopali in the Gulf of Riga, completely separating Army Group North from Army Group Center. Axis counterattacks proved useless. Between July 30th and 31st, the Soviet forces widened the corridor by capturing Birzhai, Bauska, Yonishki, and Jelgava, as well as the port of Tukums in the Gulf of Riga. Unable to reverse the situation, and after occupation of about 900 localities in a 230-kilometer advance, on August 1st, the German command ordered the evacuation of the last 10,000 soldiers from northeastern Lithuania. By the end of the day, the city of Kaunas had fallen into Red Army hands. On August 1, 1944, the 1st Belarusian Front under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky launched an additional offensive as part of Operation Bagration, driven by a direct order from Joseph Stalin. Its objective was to reach Warsaw in parallel with the Warsaw Uprising, aka Army. The advance began with General Vasily Choikov's 8th Guards Army, which crossed the Vistula in 83 DUKW amphibious vehicles, and General Alexei Radzievsky's 2nd Tank Army, which deployed 540 tanks, including 313 T-34s, 242 Stalins, 93 Shermans, and several Su-85, Su-76, and Su-57 tank destroyers. After crossing the river, Soviet forces captured Siedlce, destroying a German armored train, and then took Radzymin and the Zagreb Ridge, positioning themselves just 12 kilometers from Warsaw. It seemed that the Red Army was about to reach the Polish capital when the 2nd Tank Army made a fatal mistake. Advancing parallel to the Vistula between the Levia and Joanna rivers, it ended up in an extremely vulnerable position with no protection on its flanks. Marshal Walter Model quickly detected this weakness and assembled an armored group to launch a counterattack. His battle group included the 3rd SS Panzer Division Viking, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, and the 4th and 19th Panzer Divisions, with a total of 279 tanks, including 114 Panthers, 109 Panzer IVs, as well as Jagdpanzer IV, Marder III, and Stug III tank destroyers. On July 2, 1944, the German armored force launched a surprise attack, first destroying the Soviet supply convoys and then systematically dismantling the armored units. Without enough fuel to maneuver, the Soviets were unable to retreat or reorganize their lines. Within just 24 hours, the 2nd Tank Army was encircled on August 3rd, and after a desperate struggle, was completely destroyed on August 5th. In the battle, the Soviets lost more than 500 tanks, while the German forces suffered about 100 armored vehicle losses. The destruction of the Soviet 2nd Tank Army allowed the Axis to launch a local counter-offensive, managing to retake Radzymin and forcing the 1st Belarusian Front to retreat. With this setback, the offensive toward Warsaw was ruled out, leaving the Polish resistance without support. Ultimately, the city would be crushed by German forces and would not fall into Soviet hands until 1945. At the beginning of August, the Red Army had reached the limits of its capabilities, with supplies depleted and not enough replacements to cover the enormous losses. Meanwhile, Army Group Center had managed to reorganize after its previous defeats, establishing a solid defensive line that extended from Memel in Lithuania to Puławy in Poland, spanning 625 kilometers of trenches and fortifications. Faced with the impossibility of continuing the advance in that sector for at least 6 months, Joseph Stalin decided to bring Operation Bagration to an end. On August 5, 1944, Operation Bagration came to an end at the gates of Warsaw. Since its beginning on June 22, the Red Army had covered 600 kilometers from the outskirts of Orsha in Belarus to the Vistula River in Poland. During this sweeping offensive, Army Group Center was completely destroyed, Army Group North was isolated on the Baltic Sea coast, and Army Group North Ukraine suffered severe damage. Over the course of the campaign, 28 Axis divisions were annihilated, although the cost for the Soviet Union was high. Soviet losses amounted to 1,058,631 casualties, with 243,460 soldiers killed and 815,143 wounded, as well as the destruction of 4,226 tanks, 3,829 artillery pieces, and 82,200 aircraft. On the Axis side, casualties reached 417,000 men, 409,000 Germans, 7,000 Ukrainians, and 1,115 French from the Vichy regime, of whom 360,000 were killed or wounded and 57,000 captured. They also lost 2,000 tanks, 1,300 guns, and 57,000 vehicles. Without a doubt, Operation Bagration represented the greatest military disaster of the Third Reich in the Second World War, far surpassing the defeat at Stalingrad. The disappearance of Army Group Center allowed the Red Army to retake Belarus, Galicia, eastern Poland, southern Latvia, and half of Lithuania. Although the Axis managed to temporarily stabilize the front, the situation only held until early 1945. Once recovered from its losses, the Soviet Union launched its next offensive, advancing to Berlin, which precipitated the fall of the Third Reich. The Shadow War, the role of Soviet partisans. While the history of Operation Bagration often focuses on frontline tank battles and massive artillery, the role of the Soviet partisans in Belarus was a decisive factor in the Red Army victory. These formations included between 140,000 and 300,000 fighters, ranging from local peasants and escaped Soviet prisoners of war to specialized Soviet officers. Months before the main offensive, Joseph Stalin ordered these partisans to engage in a massive rail war. Their mission was to paralyze German logistics behind the lines. On the night of June 19, 1944, just 3 days before the main attack, partisans executed over 10,000 simultaneous explosions. They destroyed thousands of miles of railway tracks, bridges, and communication networks. When the Wehrmacht desperately needed ammunition and reinforcements, their trains were either stopped or destroyed. This made Army Group Center a blind and dead force, unable to react to the coming storm. The collapse of German logistics and supply lines. The greatest vulnerability of the German defense was its crumbling supply system. The terrain of Belarus consisted of swamps and unpaved roads. When the Red Army struck, German trucks and horse-drawn wagons became hopelessly stuck in the deep mud. In contrast, the Soviets prioritized modern logistics, utilizing thousands of American-made Studebaker trucks, which performed exceptionally well on the rugged Eastern Front. As the German Fourth Army and Ninth Army attempted to retreat, they ran out of fuel. Thousands of Tiger and Panther tanks were abandoned simply because there was no fuel to move them. Soldiers were forced to march for miles on foot, while Soviet armored columns continuously encircled them. This logistical collapse turned a tactical withdrawal into a total massacre of German manpower. The Air War, Luftwaffe's last stand in the East. By 1944, air superiority on the Eastern Front belonged entirely to the Soviet Union. The best Luftwaffe squadrons had been transferred back to Germany for the defense of the Reich, to counter Allied strategic bombing. In Belarus, Army Group Center was left with only about 40 to 50 operational fighter planes, such as the Bf-109 and Fw-190. Against this, the Soviet Air Force deployed over 6,000 aircraft. Their Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack planes, famously known as flying tanks, became the angel of death for German infantry. These planes attacked German columns at low altitudes with rockets and machine guns. There was no place for the Wehrmacht to hide. Whenever a German unit moved onto the roads to retreat, the VVS would annihilate them within minutes. The humiliation of the captured generals. A striking detail of Operation Bagration was the capture of numerous high-ranking German generals. Figures like General Gollwitzer and General Hamann were taken into Soviet captivity. Hitler was so enraged that he tried these generals in absence and sentenced them to death for failing to hold to the last man. To showcase the scale of the victory, Stalin ordered these captured generals to march through the streets of Moscow alongside 57,000 other German prisoners in July 1944. This march was a massive psychological operation, proving to the world that the myth of the superhuman Nazi army was dead. It was a victory not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of people across the globe.